Thank you, Lynette, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. I'm a bit daunted by Lynette's introduction. When she explained what I was about to tell you, I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to quite live up to that rather impressive description. I think you should assume that what I'm going to say reflects the views of the SMART Advisory Council when you agree with it, and when you disagree with what I'm about to say, you should assume it's my personal frolic that I'm indulging. But, and to some extent, both Gary and Sharon have said some of the things, perhaps in different words, but I think given that this is in a sense a coming out, it does not hurt to make some of the key points again. We are about a broader, new, different perspective as far as infrastructure and infrastructure research goes. We are about a national perspective and a collaborative perspective. What I thought I would do is give you a range of issues that fit into that broader view rather than simply what road are we going to build or what promise are we going to make in an election campaign for a piece of physical infrastructure. These are what I think are broadly some of the areas of concern in the community and some of the directions that I hope SMART, with your help, will actually take Australia in the future. My first proposition is that there has been a breakdown in public and community trust as far as infrastructure and infrastructure decision-making goes. And that's not a thing on one side of politics or the other. But if you think about it, if you think, say, about the immigration debate, not exactly in our space, for years and years there was a meaningful national consensus about immigration and immigration policy. And by its nature, that's a long-term thing. It's not something you can turn on and off at short notice. Unfortunately, in recent times, some of that consensus has disappeared. I think where we should be trying to go in infrastructure is where immigration used to be. It's sort of definitionally obvious that infrastructure is not susceptible to 4-year or 3-year nationally, or less than 3 years usually, electoral cycles. So I think if we're going to restore public, in every sense of the word public, the community at large, the players, many of the companies represented here, if we're going to restore trust in what you might call the governance of infrastructure, I do think you need to somehow move the debate to a less political and more long-term nature. And I think that does mean that in a collective sense, one perhaps does have to impress the body politic on the fact that infrastructure is actually too important to be the subject of what are we going to announce next Tuesday in some election campaign, whether it's state or federal. So I do think the starting point ought to be that collectively we should be about trying to restore a sense of long-termism and a sense of public interest rather than the notion that somehow infrastructure is simply a political plaything. Of course, politics is and should be, and governments are and should be involved in making decisions. Of course that's right. But there's no doubt the pendulum has swung a long way towards sort of short-term decision-making, and you can see it, and I could think of a few in New South Wales, but I won't, given the elections tomorrow, go into that. But so that's my starting premise, is that one does need to restore trust of the community in the governance of infrastructure. Now, in that context, and I think this point's been made by both Gary and Sharon, SMART is about taking a network, a systems, a broader approach. A knee bone is connected to the thigh bone sort of approach to infrastructure, rather than the normal thing that people think about, which is, you know, it's a question of which road or which rail line and which order are we going to build them in. So we are about the things on the bottom of that smart white whatever you call it over there. I mean, we are about analysis, about modelling, about cost-benefit analysis. We are about trying to apply science, if you will, to appropriately address the question of how we look at and how we manage the whole process of infrastructure provision from the conceptual right through to the delivery stage. And in that context, I think it's pretty obvious that if you look at the greater complexity of infrastructure provision in Australia now, and private sector involvement, all those sorts of things, and there'll be more discussion about those later in the day, the importance of both independence in reporting on some of these things and transparency. And if I can just divert for a moment into PPPs, I mean, you know, we've allowed, collective we, have allowed a totally untrue, totally absurd position to arise in terms of PPPs, and, you know, they're all failures. As I think Gerard was saying to me at dinner last night, the reality is they're not failures. The failure is in explaining who takes the risks, where the risks have fallen, and where there's been failures, where the failures have landed, and what the benefits are to the public. And again, it's part of the notion that you do need to have well-resourced, independent work being done so that people with authority and without a vested interest can help inform the debate about infrastructure as we go forward. The next point I'd like to make, which I confess is a personal hobby horse of mine, is about the necessity for whole of government, and indeed whole of governments, plural, approach to infrastructure. Let me give you a short story, and they won't mind me saying this. I had a visit from two senior people in the Newcastle Port Corporation last week, and they were concerned about the planning of the expansion of the port, which essentially is the world's largest coal loading port. And they were saying, well, you know, there's various arguments between the coal companies and concerns about the speed of provision of the loading infrastructure. They said, realistically, there's only one problem in achieving what's wanted to be achieved, and that is the pace and quality of government approval processes. All the rest of it was, in their view, quite certain to be properly handled. Now, I said to them, well, that can't be that hard. You just get all the government authorities, both state and federal, into one room, and you tell them to come out with a pathway towards as to how this is, you know, it's actually a doubling, or I think a 50% increase, further 50% increase in the capacity. And they said, oh, we hope the new government in New South Wales will have that sort of attitude. We'd get our hands cut off if we involve the federal government, EPA or whatever, in the approvals process. And this is just a nonsense. I mean, the notion that silos within state governments and then silos between governments affect really fundamental things that go to the sorts of things Sharon was talking about, jobs and prosperity and investment. The notion that that's held up because, oh, well, you know, the New South Wales EPA is going to do its thing and then the federal EPA will do its thing, and you get a sequential and argumentative process rather than effectively everyone in one room producing one pathway. So I think to the extent that SMART and all of the people represented can really beat up on the system to produce whole of government and whole of governments, or whole of public sector, whichever level, sometimes local government as well, that is a massive, could be a massive improvement in the infrastructure area. You know, we're in a world where boundaries are increasingly irrelevant, yet somehow we manage in Australia, in lots of areas, but specifically in this area, we somehow manage to allow boundaries to continue to exist and to actually bedevil the end result, which everyone's presumably trying to achieve. So where, and this, Gary certainly stressed this point, where we think this ought to go is that we need what I call a national best-in-class research effort in infrastructure. And not just because Mike's the co-host, this really does need to be led by the government, by the national government. I think there's a very bad view forming in the states that it's wonderful that the national government's involved in infrastructure, because what they really are saying is they're going to give money to various projects, including money to projects that previously the national government hasn't ever done so, and probably doesn't have all that much constitutional connection to. Well, the reality surely has to be that the national government's approach has to be of intellectual leadership. Yes, sure, I'm sure that money's always useful in these things, and there'll no doubt be things that the federal government will fund. But if you take, and mention was made of the Infrastructure Australia people here, I mean, it shouldn't and can't be seen simply as, you know, some scientific way of putting projects in a row and saying which governments, state governments have done a good or bad job. It really ought to be about, and I think is trying to be, wants to be, about intellectual leadership in this space, and it does need to be a national approach. So, and the other thing I'd say about the research approach, I almost wish we'd put applied in the thing that says an international leader in infrastructure research. I mean, this effort does need to be about results, and there is no conceivable point in having a world-class academic institute where the results are not relevant to the physical outcomes. And so it is, I think, tremendously important that what you're about is about applied research. It's about results that can be used by governments, by the private sector, by financiers, by whomever, rather than simply nice intellectual constructs. I think you'll hear a lot in that context about data, or data. It is in many ways the key missing ingredient in this debate. It's a missing ingredient in lots of areas of government, and it's very hard. It's easier, and Gary used the, you know, we're now all into evidence-based stuff, and that's, we ought to be. But it's very hard to have evidence-based decision-making if you don't have evidence, as in data, as in information, as in detail. And you know, again, I think there is a bit of a tendency for government departments who mostly have the data to sit on it. It certainly was true in New South Wales when I used to worry about these things 20 years ago. I have a shrewd suspicion might still be the case. And there really does need to be an acceptance and indeed political leadership to say that, you know, we can't actually make